January 1944. Before dawn, central Germany. The factories are quiet, but not asleep. Furnaces still glow behind shuttered windows. Rail yards sit loaded with coal, steel, unfinished engines. On paper, the Reich is still fighting a total war. Production charts still rise. Orders still move through ministries and command staffs with practiced urgency. Then the warning sirens begin again. They do not signal panic anymore. They signal routine. Along the North Sea coast, radar stations trace familiar shapes forming far beyond the horizon. The altitude is known. The direction is known. The timing is close enough to mark in pencil. Inside command rooms and air defense centers, officers watch the same pattern repeat itself. Daylight formations, tight, disciplined, moving with a confidence that no longer feels experimental. What is different now is not the size of the raid. It is what follows it. Fighters do not turn back. Bombers return the next day. And the day after that. The same targets are struck before repairs can finish. Losses are counted, then replaced, on the American side, almost immediately. Somewhere between the maps, the reports, and the endless return of engines in the sky, a realization begins to settle. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. This is not an attack meant to be survived. It is a system meant to continue. And understanding how that system came into being requires stepping back to how the United States prepared for a war it intended to outlast everyone else. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, it did not do so with a single battle plan or a short war in mind. American leadership understood something that many combatant nations still resisted accepting. This war would not be decided by brilliance alone. It would be decided by endurance, logistics, and scale. Germany had built its strategy around speed and shock. Blitzkrieg assumed wars would be short, decisive, and politically destabilizing before economies could fully mobilize. Japan's doctrine relied on distance, attrition, and the belief that America lacked the will to fight a long, costly conflict across an ocean. Both assumptions were rooted in earlier wars, and both underestimated the nature of American industrial power. By 1942, the United States was already reshaping itself into a war economy at a pace unseen in history. Civilian automobile factories were converted to aircraft plants. Refrigerator lines became bomb assembly stations. Shipyards expanded around the clock, launching Liberty ships faster than German submarines could sink them. This was not improvisation. It was planning refined through interwar studies, economic modeling, and lessons learned from watching Europe burn since 1939. The Army Air Forces became central to this vision. American planners believed air power could do more than support ground troops. It could dismantle an enemy's ability to wage war entirely. But this belief required more than aircraft. It required numbers. It required precision. And it required sustainability. Early bombing efforts in 1942 and early 1943 exposed harsh limits. Unescorted bombers suffered heavy losses deep over Germany. Schweinfurt and Regensburg proved that bravery alone could not defeat a modern air defense system. German flak belts, radar-guided fighters, and well-coordinated interception zones inflicted damage that no air force could absorb indefinitely. The lesson was not that strategic bombing was impossible. The lesson was that it had to be made continuous and protected. While Germany scrambled to adapt existing production to mounting damage, the United States expanded its solution outward. New aircraft designs entered mass production. Training pipelines lengthened but accelerated. Pilots, crews, mechanics, navigators, each became part of an assembly line as standardized as the machines they flew. By late 1943, a quiet shift was underway. American bombers were no longer being committed in the hope that losses would be acceptable. They were being deployed with the expectation that losses would be replaced, automatically. The war in the air was no longer about individual raids. It was becoming a process. And the final piece needed to turn that process into something unstoppable was already rolling off factory floors, heading toward European airfields. The missing element was range. For all of America's production strength, the air war over Europe remained constrained by geography. Bombers could reach deep into Germany, but their escorts could not always follow. Once fighters turned back, Luftwaffe interceptors waited. The result was predictable. Heavy losses at the point of maximum vulnerability, just as bombers approached critical industrial targets. German planners understood this window well. Fighter units conserved fuel and aircraft, striking only when the American formations were most exposed. For a time, it worked. Loss ratios favored the defenders, and every bomber destroyed represented not just lives lost, but months of training and thousands of industrial hours. That balance broke in late 1943. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang, fitted with external fuel tanks and powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine built under license in the United States, changed the geometry of the war. For the first time, American fighters could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe could no longer wait for a moment of weakness. There was no unguarded stretch of sky left. This was not simply a technical improvement, it was a structural one. With long-range escort in place, the American bombing campaign shifted into a new phase. Raids became predictable by design. Targets were revisited deliberately. Aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, synthetic fuel facilities, rail hubs, each was struck not for spectacle, but for cumulative effect. Repairs were monitored. Follow-up attacks were timed to interrupt recovery rather than destroy single structures. Inside Germany, the strain became measurable. Fighter pilots were lost faster than they could be trained. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft before they ever met the enemy. Replacement planes sat idle without experienced crews. Albert Speer's production miracles increasingly depended on dispersal, improvisation, and labor conditions that reduced efficiency even as output numbers appeared to rise. From the German perspective, the most alarming detail was consistency. American losses, though real, did not change the pattern. Bombers returned in the same numbers. Fighters stayed with them. There was no pause long enough to regain initiative. By early 1944, German air defense was no longer fighting to stop the bombing. It was fighting to slow it. And that distinction between stopping a system and merely delaying it marked the moment when confidence quietly began to fracture at the highest levels of the Reich. Understanding how that fracture spread requires looking at the war from several angles at once: human, technical, strategic, and psychological. For German fighter pilots, the air war changed from a contest of skill into a test of survival. In earlier phases, combat had been episodic. Missions were launched, battles were fought, and periods of rest followed. By 1944, those rhythms vanished. Interceptions were constant. Scrambles came day after day, sometimes multiple times within hours. Fatigue accumulated faster than experience. Veteran pilots were lost not only to combat, but to exhaustion and accidents. Training time for replacements shortened as pressure increased, producing young pilots with fewer hours and little tactical depth. American crews rotated home after fixed tours. German pilots did not. Survival meant flying until death, injury, or collapse removed them from the roster. This imbalance mattered. Skill was no longer evenly distributed. Each American loss was absorbed by a system designed to replace it. Each German loss removed experience that could not be recreated in time. The sky itself became asymmetric, filled with aircraft that returned tomorrow, regardless of today's outcome. On the ground, Germany fought a different battle entirely. Speer's armaments ministry pushed output to record levels even as bombs fell. Underground facilities expanded. Production lines scattered into forests, tunnels, and improvised workshops. On paper, aircraft numbers rose through mid-1944, but efficiency collapsed. Transport networks broke under repeated attacks. Components arrived late or not at all. Skilled labor disappeared into rubble, conscription, or air raid shelters. Fuel shortages forced factories to prioritize quantity over testing, producing aircraft that looked impressive, but failed quickly in service. American planners understood this dynamic. They did not aim to erase production overnight. They aimed to stretch it past breaking point. Every raid forced Germany to spend more resources defending, dispersing, and repairing than the output was worth. What Germany was losing was not factories. It was margin. And without margin, no war system survives for long. The Luftwaffe faced an impossible choice: engage American fighters aggressively and lose trained pilots in unfavorable exchanges, or avoid combat and allow bombers to operate unchallenged. There was no winning option. American escort doctrine exploited this perfectly. Fighters were no longer tethered tightly to bomber formations. They hunted. They roamed ahead, attacked airfields, caught German aircraft climbing, low on fuel, or landing. The battlefield extended from the target area to every runway in Western Germany. The result was psychological as much as physical. German pilots no longer felt safe even on the ground. Readiness declined. Initiative disappeared. And once initiative is lost in war, recovery becomes a matter of time, and time was something Germany no longer controlled. These pressures did not exist in isolation. They fed into one another, tightening the system America had built. To understand how leadership and morale responded to this collapse, we have to continue examining the remaining angles. By 1944, German leadership faced a contradiction it could not resolve. On one hand, production reports still showed impressive numbers. On the other, frontline commanders reported shrinking combat effectiveness. Aircraft existed on paper that never reached operational units. Others arrived without fuel, spare parts, or trained crews. This gap eroded trust between political leadership, industrial planners, and the military. Command decisions increasingly chased short-term relief rather than long-term recovery. Fighter units were shuffled, retasked, and rushed into combat without cohesion. Emergency programs promised miracle solutions, but delivered too late or in too small numbers to matter. American leadership, by contrast, operated within a stable framework. Strategy did not change when losses occurred. It absorbed them. Bombing schedules continued. Escort coverage expanded. The absence of panic became its own weapon. What unsettled German analysts most was predictability. The Americans did not react emotionally to success or failure. Raids followed schedules, driven by weather windows, logistics, and production cycles. Targets were chosen for function, not symbolism. This removed the illusion that Germany could force a decisive moment. There would be no single battle to turn the tide in the air. Every attempt to concentrate strength simply invited larger formations the next day. In intercepted assessments and internal memoranda, language shifted. Words like repel and defeat gave way to contain and delay. The goal was no longer victory, it was endurance. For civilians, the war took on a relentless character. There was no front line to escape to, no season of reprieve. Bombing became a condition of life rather than an event. Sirens, shelters, and rubble framed daily existence. Yet even here, American strategy remained impersonal. The intent was not terror for its own sake, but paralysis. Railways destroyed meant factories idle. Fuel shortages meant grounded aircraft. The civilian cost was real and immense, but it was tied to a system aimed at collapse, not punishment. This distinction mattered in how the war ended. The air campaign did not break Germany's will overnight. It hollowed it out. By the time the final phase arrived, the outcome was no longer in question. What remained was the moment when realization finally became unavoidable. That moment arrived not with a single raid, but with a convergence of failures that could no longer be explained away. The winter of 1944 did not bring relief. It brought clarity. By January, the American air campaign had reached a level of integration that no previous military effort had achieved. Bombers, escorts, reconnaissance, weather forecasting, logistics, and replacement pipelines now moved in sync. Losses were anticipated, calculated, and absorbed. The system corrected itself faster than the enemy could respond. Operation Argument, later remembered as Big Week, marked the visible edge of that shift. For days in February 1944, American and British air forces struck German aircraft production and assembly centers across the Reich. It was not a single decisive blow. It was a test. The Luftwaffe rose to meet it. What followed was not a victory for either side in the traditional sense. American bombers were lost. Crews were killed and captured. But something else happened in parallel. German fighter strength, already stretched thin, began to fracture. Veteran pilots were drawn into repeated engagements they could not avoid. Aircraft were destroyed not only in the air, but on the ground, caught during takeoff, landing, refueling. For the first time, German losses could not be hidden behind production statistics. The rate of pilot attrition outpaced training. Fuel reserves dipped below operational minimums. Entire squadrons existed in name only. American formations kept coming. By March, escort fighters no longer merely defended bombers. They controlled the airspace. The Luftwaffe could still fight, but only when and where it was permitted to. That distinction mattered. It marked the loss of initiative, the silent signal that the air war was no longer competitive. Inside German command circles, explanations narrowed: weather, fuel, sabotage. Anything but the truth that had become difficult to avoid. The enemy's capacity to continue had surpassed their own capacity to resist. And this was only the air war. On the ground, preparations were already underway for something even more destabilizing. The invasion of Western Europe would soon force Germany to fight a two-front war without air superiority on either front. But before that invasion ever began, the war was already decided above the clouds. The realization did not arrive as panic. It arrived as calculation. How long could this continue? How many more months could production be stretched? How much territory could be defended without fuel, pilots, or skies? The answers were no longer encouraging. And then the pressure intensified. As spring approached, the consequences of air supremacy became impossible to separate from every other front. German ground forces still existed in large numbers. Weapons were still being produced. Orders were still being issued, but the connective tissue that turned those elements into a functioning war machine was failing. Fuel was the breaking point. American planners had identified synthetic fuel plants as the Reich's most vulnerable artery. Germany had no significant natural oil reserves. Its armies, air force, and transport systems ran on fuel manufactured from coal. These facilities were complex, centralized, and difficult to replace quickly. Beginning in late spring 1944, they were hit systematically. Each strike reduced not just output, but flexibility. Aircraft were grounded to conserve fuel. Pilot training hours were slashed. Armored units limited movement. Even successful production meant little if machines could not be tested, deployed, or sustained. Reports from Luftwaffe commands grew increasingly stark. Units requested fuel allocations measured in hours, not days. Aircraft were transferred without the means to fly them. Emergency reserves were consumed simply to maintain appearances. At the same time, American fighter sweeps expanded. Airfields were attacked repeatedly. Repair crews worked under constant threat. Any concentration of aircraft invited immediate attention. The sky itself became hostile territory. When Allied forces landed in Normandy in June, the result confirmed what German planners already feared. Without air cover, troop movements were exposed. Supply columns were attacked relentlessly. Reinforcements arrived late, or not at all. Tactical brilliance could not compensate for strategic paralysis. From that point forward, German leadership spoke increasingly in terms of managing collapse rather than reversing it. Counteroffensives aimed to buy time, not victory. The Ardennes offensive later that year would gamble remaining reserves in one final attempt to disrupt the system. But even that gamble relied on fuel that barely existed. By the end of 1944, the realization was complete. Not dramatic, not public, but undeniable. The United States had not merely beaten Germany in the air. It had created a form of warfare that removed choice. There was no way to strike back proportionally, no pause long enough to recover, no single target whose destruction would stop the flow. The war could continue, but it could not be won. What followed was the inevitable consequence of that realization, played out across cities, factories, and exhausted armies as the system ground forward. The months that followed were defined not by sudden defeat, but by controlled unraveling. Germany's military structure remained intact on paper, yet its ability to function as a coordinated force steadily eroded. Rail networks lay fractured under repeated bombing, forcing supplies onto roads already under air attack. Ammunition reached front lines without fuel to move guns. Tanks arrived without trained crews. Aircraft stood lined on runways, serviceable but unusable. American air power did not need to destroy everything. It needed only to ensure that nothing could move freely. Cities across Germany bore the physical cost of this strategy. Urban centers became landscapes of debris, improvised shelters, and broken infrastructure. Fire brigades, repair crews, and civil defense units operated in a constant state of exhaustion. Recovery no longer meant rebuilding. It meant clearing just enough rubble to function another day. Yet even in collapse, Germany did not formally concede defeat. Leadership clung to the hope that delay might reshape political realities. Every week gained was treated as valuable, regardless of the cost. This logic prolonged the war, even as its outcome became increasingly predetermined. For American planners, the focus remained steady. Air operations shifted toward direct battlefield support as Allied armies advanced, but the underlying logic did not change. Mobility was denied, concentrations were broken up. Retreats were harassed relentlessly. What distinguished this phase was inevitability. Losses still occurred. Resistance still existed. But momentum no longer shifted. The system continued to operate as designed, applying pressure where recovery was weakest. By early 1945, Germany's remaining capacity to resist depended less on strategy than on endurance. Units fought on despite isolation. Civilians survived amid shortages and destruction. The war persisted not because it could be won, but because stopping required a decision that leadership refused to make. And as this pattern repeated itself across the collapsing Reich, its consequences echoed far beyond Europe, reshaping how future wars would be planned, fought, and understood. By the spring of 1945, the effects of the American system were visible in every domain of the German war effort. Front lines collapsed not because armies vanished, but because they could no longer coordinate. Orders arrived too late. Supplies could not follow. Units fought as fragments, disconnected from any larger plan. The air war continued until the final weeks, not out of necessity, but momentum. American aircraft flew missions over territories already lost on the ground, striking transportation corridors, depots, and retreat routes. The objective was no longer victory, it was closure, ensuring the war ended without the possibility of recovery. German surrender, when it came, was administrative rather than dramatic. The fighting had already been decided by systems that could not be reversed in the final months. Factories stood silent. Fuel stocks were gone. The Luftwaffe existed largely in name. What remained was a population and military structure hollowed out by pressure applied consistently over time. The psychological impact endured beyond the armistice. German officers and planners reflected not on a single defeat, but on a realization that had come earlier and deepened slowly. They had been outproduced, outsustained, and outmatched by an enemy whose strategy did not depend on perfection. This understanding did not remain confined to Europe. In the Pacific, Japanese leadership faced similar conclusions as American carrier production, submarine warfare, and long-range bombing exposed the same imbalance. Distance, once a shield, became irrelevant. Attrition favored the side that could replace losses without pause. The war ended differently in Asia, but the logic behind it was familiar. America had demonstrated that modern war could be waged as a continuous process, one that punished weakness not through spectacle, but through inevitability. By 1945, that lesson was understood globally, not because it was announced, but because it had been endured. What remained was to reflect on what such a form of warfare meant, not only for those who lost, but for the future of conflict itself. The war did not end when the last factory stopped producing or when the final aircraft fell from the sky. It ended earlier, in quieter rooms, over maps that no longer offered solutions. The moment of defeat was not marked by a single order or a single battle, but by the understanding that the future would look the same as the present, only worse. What the United States revealed during the war was not simply strength. It was a method, a way of fighting that did not depend on sudden breakthroughs or flawless execution, but on continuity. Losses were expected. Errors were absorbed. The system endured because it was designed to. For Germany and Japan, this realization carried a weight beyond military defeat. It exposed the limits of strategies built on speed, shock, and decisive moments. Against an opponent that could replace machines, train crews, and apply pressure without pause, courage and ingenuity were no longer enough. The consequences of that lesson shaped the post-war world. Military planning shifted towards sustainability. Industrial capacity became inseparable from national security. Wars were no longer measured only by territory gained or lost, but by the ability to continue fighting at scale. For those who lived through it, the cost was measured in cities, lives, and years that could not be recovered. For those who studied it afterward, the meaning was clearer. Victory did not belong to the side that struck hardest in a moment, but to the one that could continue when moments passed. That was when the war was truly lost, and that is why it ended the way it did.